Even before Donald Trump pronounced the end of globalisation, the shipping industry was effectively operating in a self-induced state of paralysis. Uncertainty over a looming trade war, the regulatory cost of carbon, and just how long the global current disruption can hide a fundamentally unbalanced shipping market had led shipping executives across the industry to conclude that doing nothing for the moment is likely the safest bet they could make. That pause is now a hard stop. What occurred last week was not just the US starting a global trade war or sparking a rout in global stock markets. It was the world's hyperpower firmly turning its back on the globalization process that it had championed and from which it had handsomely profited in recent decades. We are currently in uncharted waters, and shipping, for the moment at least, has pretty much every major decision on hold until it can collectively get a clearer view of what happens next. Now, you are likely listening to this in a week where major decisions regarding the regulatory pathway to shipping's decarbonised future will be agreed at the International Maritime Organization. So surely clarity is just round the corner, I hear you cry. Well, yes and no. Whatever the IMO's MEPC meeting decides this week, at the time of recording, is not going to be the big bang that many are anticipating. The limited clarity that it does offer will not flick a switch that sparks an immediate flood of final investment decisions and green fuel to start flowing. Whatever is decided, it will take time to filter into real-world action. It may allow people to start thinking about all of those ships that were delivered during the last new building boom and that are now heading towards 20 years of age, and it might allow them to stop using crystal balls for their financial calculations and start plugging a tangible IMO trajectory into their new building plans. But the shipyards are essentially full for the next 3 years, so don't expect ship owners to suddenly reach for their checkbooks, at least not until the prices come down. Which all leads me back to my opening point this week. The shipping industry is in wait-and-see mode for the moment. What is President Trump going to do next? What can the Europeans realistically do in response? What is China going to do? Are we really going to have peace in the Middle East? Is the Red Sea opening anytime soon? Does Russia somehow come in from the cold? Until we get answers to some of those questions, we just don't know what happens next. A decision from the IMO is not the only deciding factor that ship owners are considering right now.
If you take the geopolitical uncertainty, which is going to cause everyone to basically pause, this is a natural instinct, which means they're not going to invest. And then you kind of put on top of that, the regulatory uncertainty that could come with IMO in a couple of months. And really the key there is, are they going to really make those decisions to create the jet fuel needed to go forward, or are they going to kind of push, kind of kick the can a little bit, kick the ball further a little bit without really kind of landing on anything? What's really at stake is getting the net. It's already been a tough putt to get to net zero by 2050. This will really make it very, very difficult. And then the question is what happens? Because on top of everything else, you have, if you look at where with the shipbuilding capacity, and you see where we are with the order book, and you see that basically you got an order book basically in place right now till 2030. You hit this pause button. What's going to happen is by the time you get to 2030, you're going to have a significant amount of vessels that are about 20 years of age. So no investment, older fleet, a pause with a potential, shipbuilding, kind of tsunami coming eventually. With no real clear direction on fuels.
That's Chris Vinicki, Chairman and CEO of the US-headquartered class giant ABS. And I was talking to him on the sidelines of the recent Singapore Maritime Week events, well before the US tariffs sparked a market's meltdown. And I mentioned the timing of that because I think it's important to note that the pause in investment is not necessarily just to do with the latest crisis. It runs a little bit deeper. Chris's peers across the class sector, who collectively I would argue have a pretty accurate view of industry sentiment when it comes to investment in new buildings and retrofitting, well, they are all of a similar mind right now. Here's Knut Orbeck Nielsen, Chief Executive of D&V Maritime, responding to my question about whether the industry is currently paralysed.
Well, I would say that at least, if not paralyzed, at least everything is been given a second round of consideration. And the fact that we are facing, tariffs that might or might not be imposed, the fact that we might be facing trade wars, and we all know that that will influence the world economy. And if it influences the world economy, it will influence world trade and shipping as a part of that. So it's only natural for anyone now these days to take a bit of a breather and see where this takes us.
All of this, of course, begs the question, how long does this pause last and what happens next? Here's Nick Brown, Chief Executive of Lloyd's Register, talking at our Singapore Maritime Week Outlook event that you will have heard about in last week's edition of the podcast.
Yeah, I think inevitably things are slowing down, but I also think that we will all be in a much clearer position in 6 months from now. And I think actually our view at the moment is that shipyards are pretty much full for 2.5 years. New building prices look like they've peaked and look like they're coming down, although it depends how much new building capacity we have. It looks like we could be heading towards a two-tier market, ships going into US, ships not going into US ports. It also is going to be much clearer to us all as to what is going to be a global price on carbon and when is it coming. Obviously, some big decisions that we hope Singapore can continue to lead the way on at MEPC. Meanwhile, the fleet's not getting any younger. The training demand for our crew is only growing. And the opportunities to look for every single possible way of saving a gram of fuel are only going to become more important when that fuel becomes more expensive. And one way or another, today's fuel will become more expensive. Tomorrow's fuel is definitely going to be more expensive. So I don't think we should be slowing down our efforts to try and increase every opportunity for efficiency, whether that's through hardware or software or operating practices.
Logic would suggest that the industry is going to want to keep this current pause on investment as short as possible. There's, as you can hear, lots of reasons why we need to move ahead. But, and this is a pretty significant but that I think is worth noting, there are other reasons why the industry is currently determined to do as little as possible right now. The shipping markets have been defying economic gravity for a while, and they are, whisper it, headed for a painful crash landing that everybody is quietly trying to ignore. The course of the past 5 years has been driven by inefficiencies created by exogenous factors, and to be fair, they have been pretty plentiful and profitable. But that seemingly endless jet stream of geopolitical turbulence from COVID to wars to blocked trade arteries and profitable diversions has been masking the growing weakness on the demand side, so much so that everybody seems to have forgotten about the basic supply and demand fundamentals. Here's Adam Kent, Managing Director at Maritime Strategies International.
Well, realistically, of course, the last 5 years have been very much driven by inefficiencies within the shipping markets. Obviously, it started off with COVID and the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and the last year or so it's been very much canal focus, initially Panama Canal and more recently the Suez Canal and avoidance of the Red Sea. I think the problem is that is potentially masking some weakness on the demand side, especially if you look at a sector like the tanker sector, where we have seen a drop in Chinese consumption more recently, which has been somewhat masked by the events in the Red Sea and the additional ton miles that have been created by going around the Cape of Good Hope. Of course, last year we saw around 3 million TEU of container ships being delivered from shipyards, very little scrapping. Half of all the container ships delivered last year, around half of all the container ships delivered last year, were immediately put on the Asia-Europe trade route. If we didn't see those diversions and vessels were going through the canal, that reduces sailing times by 10 to 14 days, which would have had an impact on the market, even though we did see actually growth in container ship demand last year. if we sort of start looking forward and starting to unwind some of these inefficiencies, there are lots of vessels on the order book. We can't get away from that. And of course, with discussions in and around what's going to go on with Chinese shipbuilding and potential cancellations, that could take a small slice off the top of the order book, but realistically, most of the vessels on the order book will be delivered in the next 3 years. That is sort of coming at a usual time within the shipping industry. A lot of vessels coming off the order book where we're potentially going to see a relative slow growth in demand. The Chinese economy still isn't firing on all cylinders. A lot of Chinese demand, certainly on the dry bulk side last year, was being driven by stockpiling rather than actual consumption of coal and iron ore. So the market does look like, you could say there are some comparisons to where we were, say, 2000, I don't like to say it too loudly, but in 2010 to 2015.
The other factor, of course, is the fact that for the past 3 years running, we, along with everybody else, have been predicting that this will be the year that we finally start scrapping some of that older tonnage that needs to be removed from the market. Every year we've been wrong, but that backlog is starting to look problematic. The point that I'm making here is that it's not just one single problem or solution that is going to determine how long this current pause lasts. Here's Chris Vinicki again.
Some of this stuff you'll get through the system, okay? I mean, it's, we're a very resilient industry. We'll get through it. Things like tariffs, we'll figure out how to rewire ourselves, reset ourselves, do what we need to do. Some of it may be do nothing at all, just kind of wait. We'll get through some of that. But, you've got the scrap, you got the tail that you got to deal with. But the calculus to get to net zero, Richard, by 2050, with all this aside, is pretty compelling. I mean, you need about, you need about some sort of mixture of 70% zero carbon fuels, which requires 10 times more renewable energy and 30%, let's say, carbon neutral fuels that 100 times more carbon capture. Those are pretty compelling numbers. And you put that against the backdrop of kind of the bumper guards, which is the boundary conditions, which, everyone is kind of acknowledging they're working on. Obviously, safety is one that's near and dear to us. Then, that's the unintended safety consequences of change, which, by the way, even with these tariffs, my biggest worry is not the tariffs, it's the unintended safety consequences of change as a result of the tariffs in terms of behaviors and things like that and so forth. But then you got the availability, affordability, scalability of fuels. And the other one that you have that people don't talk about is infrastructure. And infrastructure is a 10-year term. So, and so you kind of begin to put all together what's at stake here is, net zero by 2050.
So, energy, security, trade wars, tariffs, that's all added uncertainty into the market. But that uncertainty was already there. We already knew that the incoming US government was going to be far less encouraging towards climate-related investment. But it didn't take a huge amount to blow all this off course. We are already looking at a change of heart when it comes to the much-discussed multi-trillion-dollar climate decarbonisation investments required across the industry. Has all this disruption simply provided cover for a sector that was already looking for an excuse to dial back on what is an expensive and risky transition?
Yeah, I think it's certainly put strain on the timescale, for sure. And these days, when the IMO meet again with 175 different nation states, different agendas, I think the uncertainty also on what they might come to agree on depends a lot on many other issues that are beyond the decarbonisation agenda. So I remain optimistic that we will have some progress, but I'm a little bit concerned on the timeline.
Whatever is decided this week at the IMO is not going to be a silver bullet. As important as it clearly is, it's not going to unlock a generation of investment immediately, and it won't be the end to this current hesitancy that we're seeing from an industry that is very unclear about what its future looks like.
No, I think still it will be mostly commercially driven. We've seen the uptake more significantly in certain sectors where the end consumer is closer to the business. And that has been very evident in the PCTC market, where you have the shippers of the cars naturally that has a very big interest in shipping electric cars in a environmental friendly way, as it were. So yeah, but it's probably not going to sort of be a major shift out of the IMO this time around. The important thing is that we get it going. And obviously a price on carbon will be essential to get things going, and then the timeline will be very much affected by the level of intensity of that price and how fast it will, let's say, escalate to a stage where it actually makes sense to really invest in these types of fuels. But it's not all about the fuels. I mean, we tried to put that forward many times, right? If you think about it, we are so hung up on, the 8% of the order book that is dual fuel, right? But it remains 92% of the vessels that are out there sailing on, traditional fuels. And that's still going to have a big impact on our progress towards net zero. And if I may, that's why I think, putting focus also on carbon capture makes sense. And it is also not an easy thing. It's a technology maturing issue, but it's also very much a system issue in the way that you need reception facilities, you need credit systems that allow for it, and it will only work for those segments where you are more or less trading port to port. I mean, if you're in tramp shipping, obviously it will not make sense because you don't know where you can offload anything that you manage to capture on board.
All of this, of course, leads us back to the underlying issue that we've been grappling with as an industry since well before tariffs and the lion's share of the geopolitical uncertainty really kicked off. As an industry, we are divided, roughly speaking, into 3 swim lanes. The first mover leaders, who have been investing in a progressive agenda of efficiency and sustainability, or at least the optionality of that future, I would argue. The second group, which is the fast followers, who have at least invested in sufficient energy efficiency to get them through to the next phase of a dramatically changed future. And the third and largest group that really have done very little at all, if anything. And therefore, this great pause that we're experiencing now is arguably just an extension of business as usual for the majority of shipping. Is this hiatus on investment and progress going to divert that long-term course of shipping's 2050 net zero targets? Or is it going to leave those first movers isolated with the risk of stranded investment? Well, I don't know. But according to Iman Abdallah from Cargill, who spoke at our Singapore Outlook event only a few weeks ago, the answer is no. If anything, she's sounding even more defiant than ever.
We can't stall. That's the underlying message. We cannot stall. We need to advance our agendas, and we need to make sure that we're actually acting on our commitments. Are we going to be isolated? No, I don't think so, because eventually those that have not embarked on a similar journey are going to realize that they have to play ball. Otherwise, their existence is actually at stake. And thanks to a lot of different associations and organizations that are advocating for transparency, for advocating for data democratization. And as long as you have first movers, yes, there are laggers, but again, it becomes an existential question. If you don't come on board, you were asking before, who are the winners and who are the losers? The winners are those that realize from today that they need to adapt. The winners are those that realize that, is my fleet going to be efficient enough? How much am I going to be penalized when there are international regulations and there is a carbon price? Will I be in a position to be able to trade compliance, for example? Who are my suppliers? Who are my customers? And who are my ultimate partners? So those questions are existential questions as far as I'm concerned.
I don't, unfortunately, have any real certainty that I can offer you that is going to unlock this current pause we find ourselves in. I will, however, make one final point to end on, and that's if we look at the impact of Donald Trump's first very climate-skeptic turn in the White House, the total investment that continued to flow into decarbonisation or energy transition technologies effectively doubled in that period, hitting around $2 trillion by 2024. And that momentum towards decarbonisation has continued regardless. And while we're seeing some of that stalling, and obviously there are going to be winners and losers over the next 4 years, I think that the direction of travel still seems clear. As for the rest of the geopolitical uncertainty that is currently keeping shipping's investment decisions in stasis, well, we will continue to cover those trends on Lloyd's List, and no doubt it will be the subject of podcasts to be recorded later in the year. For this week, though, I want to thank everybody who's contributed to this edition, both in terms of those you have heard and those you have not heard who have been talking to me in the background. And as ever, thank you to everybody out there for listening. We will be back next week, hopefully with some more clarity and answers, but certainly with some of the stories shaping shipping. But for now, thank you. Goodbye.